Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Julie, and I organize webinars for the Claire Booth Luce Center for Conservative Women. And I'm so happy for you to join us this afternoon with our guest speaker, Heather McDonald. Here at the center, our mission is to prepare women for effective leadership and to promote leading conservative women. Our materials, programs, and initiatives support ideas and efforts that are pro-America, pro-family, and support free enterprise. We encourage our supporters and students to be active ambassadors of conservative philosophy in their schools, workplaces, and communities. If you are interested in learning more about the Center for Conservative Women, I invite you to visit our website at cplwomen.org and follow us on all our social media platforms. Joining me today is one of the Center's Fall Fellows, Gloriana Durapantini. Gloriana is from Virginia and currently a junior at East Tennessee State University. She is majoring in media and communications with a minor in digital media. We are so thankful to have Gloriana with us this fall.
Heather McDonald is the Thomas W. Smith Fellow at the Manhattan Institute, a contributing editor of City Journal and a New York Times bestselling author. She is a recipient of the 2005 Bradley Prize. Her work at City Journal has covered a range of topics, including higher education, immigration, policing, homelessness and homeless advocacy, criminal justice reform, and race relations. Ms. McDonald's award-winning writing has appeared in major newspapers throughout the country. Attorney General Jeff Sessions called her the greatest thinker on criminal justice in America today. A non-practicing lawyer, Heather McDonald clerked for the Honorable Stephen Reinhardt, U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit, and was an attorney advisor in the Office of the General Counsel of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, and a volunteer with the Natural Resources Defense Council. She has frequently testified before U.S. House and Senate committees. In 1998, she was appointed to Mayor Rudolph Giuliani's task force on the City University of New York. Heather is a frequent guest on radio and TV programs. Ms. McDonald holds a BA in English from Yale University, an MA in English from Cambridge University, and a JD from Stanford University Law School. Today, she will be speaking to us about the war on cops and the problem with race-based attacks on the criminal justice system. These ideas erode the authority of law and put lives at risk. America is in need of clarity on these issues, and she brings facts to the discussion. Please join me in welcoming Heather McDonald.
Thank you so much, Julie and Gloriana. It's a great pleasure to be with Claire Booth Luce Center again. And congratulations on keeping your institution going and thriving in this really challenging time. And thank anybody who's listening today for taking time to talk about a topic that I think is not getting enough coverage in this election cycle, but that is bringing our country to the abyss of a very terrifying possibility of a true breakdown of law and order. Since the summer, we've seen one set of riots after another, wholesale destruction of the hard work of entrepreneurs, their lives worth of effort, dreams, courage, risk-taking, gone up in smoke as hordes of people have looted and ransacked their businesses. We've seen officers attempted to be assassinated, shot at, attacked, run over with cars, law-abiding people killed. The homicide rate has jumped through the roof since the summer, all in the service of a lie, which is that the policing system in this country and the criminal justice system more generally is racially biased against Black men, and that we're living through an epidemic of racially biased shooting of Black men. Those two propositions are patently false. But first, let me say, of course, the police need to treat everyone they encounter with courtesy and respect. Lethal force has to be a last-minute resort. Officers are desperate for more hands-on tactical training so that they do not find themselves in the situation where the use of lethal force is their only option. They want more de-escalation training. They want more training in taking cover, trying to slow situations down. All of those things are good ideas and necessary. But what is a very bad idea is to criticize the police for a situation not of their own making. For the last 3 or 4 decades, we have been talking about phantom police racism in order not to talk about a far more serious and real problem, which is disproportionately high rates of Black crime. The police are the messenger. They don't determine what neighborhoods they go to, what 911 calls for drive-by shootings they answer. Those decisions are made by victims and their criminals in the choice to engage in predatory street crime. Let me give you some data, and numbers are always hard to take in orally, but we've got to go through a few just to rebut this phony narrative. Last year, according to the Washington Post database of fatal police shootings, these are shootings by the police of civilians that are fatal. As of June 2nd, the police had fatally shot 9 unarmed Blacks. 9. That's out of 7,400 Black homicide victims the previous year. So that's about 0.1% of all Blacks who were killed by homicide in 2019 were killed by a cop. And those 9 unarmed victims is likely an overstatement in any case, because the Washington Post uses the most liberal methodology it possibly can to categorize somebody as an unarmed victim of a police shooting. If you're grabbing an officer's gun, which puts him on very bright notice that you intend to shoot him. If you're escaping from a lawful car stop in a car with an armed semi-automatic weapon in the seat next to you, you still get to count as an unarmed victim of a police shooting. Each year, there's about 1,000 police shootings of civilians. That's a number that's held remarkably stable for the last 5 years since the Washington Post started collecting its database on fatal police shootings. Over 50% of all those fatal police shooting victims are white, and around 25% each year are Black. Now, the mainstream media, left-wing activists, and many academics get their hands on that 25% Black fatality rate and declare that that shows police bias. Why? Because they use the wrong benchmark to compare it to. If there's one thing you should take away from our talk today, it is the all importance of choosing the right benchmark for evaluating police activity. The wrong benchmark is the one that is inevitably used in the media, in academic studies, and that is a population benchmark. So let's look at the numbers again. About 25% of all fatal police shootings have Black victims. Blacks are about 13% of the nation's population. So they're shot at twice the rate of their representation in the population. Does that show that the police are biased? If population were the proper benchmark, yes, that would be a plausible argument. However, the cops don't determine their activity, their deployment based on population demographics. They go, as I said before, to where people are being most victimized, where crime is highest, where they're getting those 911 calls for drive-by shootings coming over the radio, and that is overwhelmingly in Black neighborhoods. If you look nationally, Blacks commit about 60% of all robberies and homicides nationwide, even though in the 75 largest counties of the United States, even though in those counties they're 15% of the population, they commit homicide at a rate that's about 11 times that of whites. If you look at individual cities, the disparities are just as large. In Chicago, for example, Blacks and whites are each about a little under a third of the city's population. Blacks commit about 80% of all homicides and shootings. whites about 1%. That means that a Black Chicagoan is about 50 times more likely to commit a shooting or homicide than a white Chicagoan. Now, I'm often told when I give these numbers by well-meaning audience members, they said these numbers make us feel uncomfortable. And if you're having that same reaction, I'm sorry. I would say, I was once asked by the Teneo group, what does that mean that we feel uncomfortable? And I said, it means that this is not a white supremacist country. White supremacists would not feel uncomfortable about the crime rates. Good-meaning, well-meaning Americans are, because A, they've been kept in such ignorance about them, and because they turn their eyes away out of a sense of modesty and shame from the breakdown that affects certain members of the inner city population. Nevertheless, if we're going to be calling the cops racist, if we're going to be saying that white Americans are bigots, but above all, if we're going to be tarring the police with the most lethal and destructive charge that you can use today, to say that they are involved in a racist war on Blacks, you damn well better get your numbers right. So when you look at the 25% ratio of victims of fatal police shootings that are Black, that's actually less than would be predicted by the Black crime rate. There's an academic who studied this. He wrote a paper in the very prestigious Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences that was published last year that found absolutely no bias in police shootings. I cited that paper at the early part of this summer, right after the George Floyd riots, in an article in the Wall Street Journal that said there's no systemic racism in police shootings, because I had cited it, the study, and it had gotten into the public discourse. The author retracted the study. He said, I stand by the findings. Everything I say in there is true, but it is being cited for the proposition that there's no bias in police shootings, which is what it stated. He retracted it. That shows the pressure on academics today to hoe the line. Fortunately, he didn't retract a 2018 paper of his, which came to the exact same conclusion, and which stated, and I quote virtually verbatim, that when you take crime rates into account, the disparities in police shootings flip 100%. And it's whites who are overshot compared to their crime rates. So the narrative is false. And this goes for non-lethal use of force as well. There's one study by Roland Fryer that purports to show that Blacks have non-lethal force used on them at a higher rate. He does not adequately take into account Blacks' rate of resisting arrest. One study found that Blacks resist arrest at 4 times the rate of whites. It has long been known that the biggest predictor of officer behavior is civilian behavior. If a civilian is resisting, if he's not complying with an officer's lawful orders, the officer is going to escalate his own force until he gains compliance. So, you know, he's first use verbal commands, then he may put his hands on a suspect. If the suspect starts fighting him, he's going to have to escalate further. And sometimes, sadly, he may reach the point of having to use lethal force. Believe me, no officer wants to do that. The shooting that we saw this week that is now set Philadelphia burning, that has caused 200 pharmacies to be looted for the drugs, that has caused a remarkably barbaric chain reaction of looters looting other looters. It looks like a good shooting. The man they'd been called to a domestic violence incident. He had a long history of attacking females, and he refused to put his knife down, having been told numerous times by the cops to do so and was approaching them at a very fast rate. The victim's father has told his lawyer that he does not want the police officers charged with murder because even he recognizes that given that the officers were not equipped with tasers, given his son's approach at them with a knife, they had no choice but to use their guns. Nevertheless, this is immediately being slotted into the usual narrative about police bias and Black lives being taken by cops. I'm at present compiling a list of the children, the Black children who have been killed in drive-by shootings since the George Floyd arrest and death in late June. It is stunning. It is utterly stunning. Well more than 4 dozen 1-year-olds, 3-year-olds shot in drive-bys, shot in front of their homes, shot in their bedrooms, shot in their living rooms, shot playing in their backyards, in these insane drive-by shootings that nobody wants to look at. If 4 dozen white children had been shot since June, there would be a national revolution. The media that thinks of itself as so anti-racist doesn't give a damn about these Black lives, nor do the Black Lives Matter activists. They have said not a word about these child victims because they don't fit the narrative, because they have all been shot by young Black men. If they'd been shot by a cop, it would be a different matter. The only Black lives that the media care about, that Democratic politicians care about, are those rare instances where they're taken by a cop, or even better, by a white, which is rarer still. Let me give you another piece of numerical data. LeBron James this summer has been going around tweeting that Blacks are being hunted by whites, in essence. You know, we can't step out of our house without getting shot. This is a trope that Barack Obama has used, that Joe Biden has used. It is completely false. When you look at all the universe of interracial violence between Blacks and whites Blacks on Blacks, Blacks commit 88% of all interracial violence between Blacks and whites less than 12%. So the idea that it is whites that are the threat to Blacks is another specious lie. And yet, after the recent shooting in Philadelphia, Joe Biden used the usual maudlin tropes of the Black Lives Matter movement, that he's got sympathy for everybody who's shattered by another Black life taken, implicitly by another Black life taken by the police. Where was Biden when those 4 dozen, 5 dozen, I haven't totted them up completely, Black children were killed? Nowhere to be seen. So what's happening now? Police officers are backing off under this phony narrative. The situation on the streets is utterly appalling. During riots, cops are struck with concrete, with rocks, with glass bottles. As I say, they're run over with cars. Their cop cars are torched. Their precinct houses are burned. In Minneapolis, there was an attempt to burn down a precinct house, the 3rd precinct, and with officers inside. They're cursed at. In Philadelphia, one officer was covered head to toe with blood thrown at him. It's absolutely brutal. Officers are leaving the profession at record rates. They're telling anybody they know, don't become a cop. Recruiting is going to become almost impossible. And they are backing off from the kind of proactive policing that saves lives. They have an option. If they're driving around at 2 a.m. in a cop car, waiting for the next radio call and they see somebody on a drug corner hitching up his waistband as if he had a gun, they can keep on driving and wait for the next drive-by shooting call, or they can get out of their car and ask that guy a couple of questions, which they're legally entitled to do. That stop is a proactive stop. It is discretionary. The cops don't have to do it. When they come under this incessant narrative about their being racist for engaging in the Black community, they stop doing that proactive activity. Why should they? They find themselves, when they get out of their cars, surrounded by hostile, jeering crowds. The cell phones are out immediately. And so they become very passive and they go into a purely reactive mode of policing. That's gone on. We've seen this summer in the 27 cities that were surveyed, homicide rates are up over 50%. The lives taken are Black. The activists don't give a damn. And the violence is tearing down our cities. What is amazing to me is that this has not been more of a campaign issue. The riots are out of sight, out of mind, in large part because the media will not cover them. I was in Wisconsin in early October, and I assumed, given that Kenosha had very bad rioting after a police shooting, pictures make it look like the aftermath of aerial bombing. Buildings absolutely reduced to rubble, steel girders twisted towards the sky. Again, entire life work reduced to nothing in this frenzy of destruction. I assumed, given Kenosha, that Wisconsin would be solidly pro-Trump because he's the only one who has defended the cops, who has defended law and order. It's not. And somebody told me that, spoke to somebody in Janesville, Wisconsin, which is not too far from Kenosha, that Janesville resident was virtually in the dark about what had gone on in Kenosha. So the media is invested in keeping the public in the dark. And it turns out the American public would rather be fearful of a phantom overhyped threat of COVID than to be concerned about what is a far more real danger, which is the breakdown of law and order. I'll just make a few more remarks. The other thing that's happening in our criminal justice system, so remember the benchmark. If ever somebody gives you numbers that they claim show police racism, car stops are a frequent example of this. You'll hear that, Blacks say make up 50% of all car stops in a jurisdiction, though they are 25-30% of the population. One, you have to know what's the demographics of the road, but what you really have to know is what's the behavior. You need to know the behavior benchmark. And it turns out when it comes to car stops, when this was still allowed to be studied before this became a taboo subject, that Blacks speed at about twice the rate of whites. So always look for the benchmark. And here's one other takeaway from today: disparate impact. Disparate impact is a legal concept that holds that colorblind practices that are not discriminatory, there's no intent to discriminate, can nevertheless be judged discriminatory if they have a disparate impact on minority populations. So if an employer wanting a relatively literate workforce uses a high school reading exam as a job qualification and asking people to be able to read at a high school level knocks out a disproportionate number of Black applicants because their literacy skills are so low, that employer cannot use a reading test as a job qualification unless he can justify its use with a very stringent standard in court. So what's going on now in our criminal justice system is that a whole host of criminal justice practices that are perfectly colorblind, that have been part of the criminal justice system for centuries, are being thrown out the window because they have a disparate impact on Blacks. Why? Not because those procedures are racist or discriminatory, but given the Black crime rate, which is exponentially higher, there is not a single criminal justice law which does not have a disparate impact on Blacks. So we're getting rid of arrests for turnstile jumping in subways, for low-level shoplifting. We're just summoning them or asking people not to do that. We're getting rid of bail. We're getting rid of a whole host of quality of life, public order enforcement, which the good, many good law-abiding residents, hardworking residents of minority communities beg the police to enforce. All of this is being thrown out the window because of disparate impact. It means that in the years ahead, crime is going to continue getting worse. Whoops, sorry about this. I should have unplugged this. Let me take this. Sorry. Hello? I'm busy right now. Thank you. All right. Okay. Well, I will take that as a wake-up call and end there, and look forward to any questions.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Ms. McDonald. We have several questions already, as this is a very interesting and difficult and hot topic, especially with just the last recent weeks. First, we'd like to ask, generally, regarding the Black Lives Matter movement, how has this movement gained so much traction? It seems like there's the question sort of is like asking, it seems like it sort of came and it's just huge and it's being accepted everywhere as if you're sharing facts, but it's being accepted everywhere as the opposite.
Right. Well, here's the answer everybody wants to hear in my experience, not necessarily this group, but I get asked a lot. It is not the Soros Foundation. That is a reassuring answer, that if we could just get rid of George Soros, everything would be fine. You know, it's a sort of a conspiracy theory. It's not the case. Black Lives Matter is relatively disorganized. It's autochthonous. It bubbles up from the ground. It is not a matter of there being a sort of a mastermind off stage. It is driven by the willingness of whites to blame themselves for the problems in the inner city, and to not be willing to speak up and join forces with those law-abiding bourgeois Blacks who I talk to all the time when I go to police community meetings in the inner city, who beg for more police protection. But we are living through a moment of bizarre, I would say it's almost a psychosis on the part of elite liberal whites who are engaged in this frenzy of self-flagellation, saying that they are responsible for everything in the world and that white supremacy defines this nation. They do not want to look at the breakdown in Black culture, and that's a relatively recent thing. And as several decades ago, there was, every so often, it was possible to describe the fallout from, I would say, the primary driver of the dysfunction that leads to these insane drive-by shootings is family breakdown. The fact that about 70% of Black children today are born in fatherless homes, that is a civilizational catastrophe. But the left is invested in the narrative that Western civilization is racist, that American civilization is racist, and there's a symbiosis between their own virtue signaling in blaming themselves for phantom racism and that segment of Black activists who realize that there is enormous power today in victimhood, and who play that against very willing whites. Anybody who's been on a college campus over the last decade has seen this happen. There is a codependency between the college administration, above all the diversity bureaucracy on the one hand, and entitled, narcissistic, self-involved students who act out little psychodramas of oppression before a willing audience of diversity bureaucrats who benefit from the victim status of the students by being able to expand their domain. So it's a very bizarre and tragic relationship. And it means that the problems that are driving Black crime and that result sometimes in fatal police shootings are not going to get solved because the country turns its eyes away.
These are such big issues. And something that really affects a lot of the young women that we work with, and there's several questions on this, combine them. How did we reach this point as the society or community that we are unable to have this freedom of speech and the capacity to discuss issues when you have people, like, the question is, what's the pressure behind someone retracting a study, a legitimate study that they have done and published, has been reviewed, it has been, peer reviewed, all the things that you want, and then to have it retracted because it speaks against a political narrative. How did we get here? Is this coming through universities? I know a lot of the girls experience a lot of negative things in universities, or is this something bigger than that?
Well, that's about the best question you could ask, and you are appropriately appalled, shocked, and puzzled. How did we get here? And yes, I just want to reiterate, Julie, what you said. This is such a perversion of how the scientific method, how the accumulation of knowledge is supposed to work. You achieve a fact, you achieve some known truth, and you move on. That becomes part of the legacy of human knowledge. You do not retract that fact simply because you're under political pressure. I will say not only did they retract it, but a physicist at Michigan State University, where the lead researcher on this study worked, and who was responsible for handing out the university's research money to its own faculty, and who had funded the criminological work of this Joseph Cesario. This physicist, Stephen Sue, was fired from being able to allocate any more research grants. So that is one physicist who has now become very politically incorrect because he's now been canceled himself. So the ramifications go on and on. How did this happen? I'm going to be very blunt. And I've come to this conclusion through decades of observation. I don't reach it lightly. I don't reach it happily. I think that a problem that is behind a lot of the things that we're seeing in our culture today, with the cancellation of speech, the narrowing of what may be said and possibly thought, a lot of this, not all of it, obviously feminism is a scourge, radical feminism is a scourge on our culture, denying biological truths, demanding the evisceration of meritocracy. But in my decades of writing on public policy and going out into neighborhoods, I think that it is the ongoing failure to close the achievement gap between whites and blacks, and it's very large. Your average black 12th grader reads at the level of the average white 8th grader. A very small percentage of black high school students are deemed college ready on the SAT. I think the discomfort with that fact, if you go down deep enough, that's driving a lot of our left-wing culture. The elites do not, they are preemptively setting up the only allowable explanation for ongoing racial disparities after decades of government welfare spending, redistribution spending. The only allowable explanation for that ongoing disparity is white racism. And this summer was just a paroxysm. There was not a single corporation, university president's office, theater group, opera company, restaurant that didn't issue a statement decrying American white supremacy. White supremacy, give me a break. Let's just talk about Republicans. White Republicans have had one love affair after another with black politicians and public figures, whether it's Colin Powell, Herman Cain, late lamented, Alan West, Alan Keyes, Ben Carson, now John James in Michigan. They don't give a damn about color. What they care about is the perceived values of candidates and their neighbors. There isn't a single mainstream institution in this country that has not been tying itself into knots for the past several decades, trying to hire and promote as many Black and Hispanic candidates as possible. Colleges, far from being white supremacist or bigoted, they all have massive racial preferences in admissions, admitting Blacks and Hispanics with much lower qualifications because they want minorities so much. And yet, we're still accepting this lie about white supremacy. It is completely bizarre.
A question that just came in, which is very interesting based on what you're saying, is if this is the media setup, the university setup, the mindset of Hollywood, the majority, this is a big question, how do we go from here? How do we build unity from an attitude and idea that isn't based in facts? How do you unify America after the summer?
Man, I'm going to be honest again. I don't think it's possible. I really don't. I have the movement to the left, which is not surprising. I mean, people like me, and I'm not the only one doing this. I mean, Roger Kimball, there's been lots of us who for the last 40 years have been screaming from the rooftops, Americans, pay attention to universities. There is a poison coming out of them. The identity politics, the glorification of phony victimhood, the hatred towards Western civilization. There is a poison coming out of them. It is infecting corporations, the art sphere. You've got to pay attention. Nobody did. But this summer, things have gotten even worse than I, who am a pessimist, could have believed. And the rioting that we've seen, the justification for violence, it's extraordinary. And I'm afraid that I've been toying with ideas of succession or worse. I really do not know. I ask myself, at what point does my worldview start to branch off from people on the left? And I have to go very far back before I find any point of agreement. We can't even agree that there are biological males and females and that is determinative. We certainly don't agree that law and order is a precondition for civilized society. for people to be able to thrive, for people to be able to engage in the extraordinary beauty and complexity of voluntary exchange, of being able to build enterprises and empires through voluntary exchange. We don't agree on that. I don't know what we agree on, but I will say this. You've got to tell the truth. Do not let them cow you. If you're called a racist, if you're called a sexist, and you know that you have the facts on your hand, never apologize. The apologies, we've lived through one of the weirdest moments ever. I don't know if your members, Julie, followed this. Early in the fall at the business school of the University of Southern California, USC, there was a professor who was teaching an online course, and he's sort of in the marketing communications field. And he was giving examples about so-called filler words that people use in conversations, like or that, or God forbid for your generation, like, which drives me crazy, like this, like that, like that. And so he was giving an example from China, in case the students went to China, and they use a word that means that is nigay. I'm mispronouncing it, but in Mandarin it's something like nigay. And he was giving this, he always used this example. Well, a few black students in his class complained to the dean because they said that the word sounded like the N word, and therefore he was engaged in not just a microaggression, but a macroaggression. The dean of the business school immediately removed him from teaching. And the dean issued this enormous apology about the school's racism. It initiated a weeks-long investigation of the professor for using a Mandarin word in a context that clearly had nothing to do with the N-word. And yet the administration caved in, and the professor apologized. After a weeks-long investigation, he was cleared of being discriminatory, yet he apologized again. Can I just emphasize that we are in a period of utter, certifiable madness. Hundreds, thousands of blacks are getting killed in drive-by shootings, and we are focusing on a Mandarin word as if that is the problem. So do not apologize. Stand by your guns. And other than that, I don't know. It's up to you guys at Clare Boothe Luce to be the political strategist and think about how we bring things together. All I know is to tell the truth as I see it.
We greatly appreciate you telling the truth. These are, I did hear of that situation. It's a startling thing. I mean, I speak Arabic, and there's a few words, and well, more than a few you could say in Arabic that would sound questionable in other languages, but that's how you use the phrase. That's how you say things, and you couldn't communicate properly if you chose not to use those words. It's not even logical. Another question we have here is, how can we extend a helping hand to police officers right now? What can we do that would be supportive, so they don't feel like they need to quit? They don't feel like they have to run from this negativity.
That is such an empathetic question. Obviously, it depends on what sort of city you're in. If you're in a suburban driving city, it's very hard to go up to an officer and say, "Thank you, officer," because everybody's in cars, but I try to do that in the subways of New York. So short of that, I don't know. Perhaps writing letters to the chief and just express, because I can guarantee you those will be read at roll call. Officers are absolutely desperate at this point. In the political arena, if there's anybody in your district that is running on a police platform, support that. There are a few pro-cop groups out there. I think there's one, Blue Lives Matter, perhaps. I'm not sure, what sort of avenues they may have for assistance. It's a very good question. And I wish I had a better answer, but I honor you in your understanding that the sense of having the whole world against you is overwhelming. But this is what I hear from cops all the time. As the hatred bears down on them, they say, we are working for the good people in this community, and they hold in their hearts that knowledge. People like an elderly woman in the 41st precinct of the South Bronx, who during a police community meeting that I attended, stood up and out of nowhere, apropos of nothing, just blurted out, how lovely when we see the police. They are my friends. The police work for those people. So I will have to leave it to your own creativity to figure out better ways to get your support to them, but they sure need it.
It's definitely, the person who asked the question, it's definitely a good effort and something that people all look to pursuing in a small, even if it's just a small way, if that's what you can do. Another question, what are your thoughts on those who advocate for social workers to respond to 911 calls? And do you think this will eventually backfire? Should it be tried and people will want police presence, or will this disintegrate the police force in general?
It's a good question. I think those social workers are going to turn tail very quickly. Domestic violence calls are some of the most challenging that officers go to. They have no idea what they're walking into. The scariest thing are car stops. Those are the most dangerous, but domestic violence is also very dangerous. I mean, a large percentage of the shootings, Lancaster, Pennsylvania this year, just now in Philadelphia, Jacob Blake, these were domestic violence calls. So I think that the idea that you can do this without the possibility of some sort of force as a backup is a bit naive. But listen, there's a part of me, to be honest, and cops are too professional to do this, I think they should just walk off the job. You know, if they're getting a message, we don't want you, from a large segment of the population, just don't show up. You guys think you can do this better? Go. Just try it. You know, we've seen in Minneapolis very fast, the shootings are through the roof there. The Minneapolis Council began this summer with defunding. Now they're furiously backpedaling, saying, well, we didn't really mean that because it turns out we need the cops. But I would love to have a very clean experiment, not just sort of the de facto depolicing that's going on, but an absolute pull them out and let's see what happens. And we know what will happen, but it would be instructive for the country at large to see how essential the police are in those communities.
You reminded me, when you were speaking, we did have a small glimpse of that when we had in Portland. They set up the independent Chaz situation over the summer, and someone did, in fact, one of their enforcement officers did shoot someone and kill them. So we did see that kind of almost come full circle in a way. What someone is wondering here, another question is, how can the individuals that you're speaking to, the people who live in these communities, who want the police officers, and they want this enforcement, they want the police officers to be in the community, what can we do to support them? How can we get their voices heard? Because often this person is saying, in the media, we don't see this. So how can we help those people? Because those are the people who need the police.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know, like I've made it my mission to give them voice. You're absolutely right. They do not get hurt. However, it was very interesting. After the first iteration of Black Lives Matter, which was 2015 and 2016, when there were an additional 2,000 Black homicide deaths in 2015 and 16, thanks to depolicing. And what we're going to see this year is going to put that, make it look like child's play. But there were riots in Baltimore, the Freddie Gray riots. Well, interestingly, both the left-wing Baltimore Sun and the Washington Post finally got off their butts and sent reporters to some police community meetings in West Baltimore. And they both reported the same thing. Black business owners in those communities saying, bring back the jump out squads. These are cars, like patrol cars that come drive into drug sets and then the officers jump out. They said, a copy store owner said, it's like a drug sellers convention around here. You guys have backed off of drug enforcement, and my customers aren't coming. They're too scared. I've got do not loiter, do not trespass signs all over my property, but the drug dealers are all hanging out. And both papers reported that elderly women were terrified to go out. This is the one time I've ever seen the mainstream media actually report these voices. Most of the time they're silent. What can you do to amplify them? I don't know. If you're a reporter, if you want to write journalism, go to these meetings. I can guarantee you, you'll hear them. You will never hear, we want less police. You will never hear it. End of story. You will hear, we want more police. Why aren't you arresting the kids hanging out on the corners, fighting it by the hundreds? Why don't you arrest the dealers? There's somebody smoking marijuana on my corridor. Why don't you arrest him? It's just, if you want to hear law and order, go to a police community meeting in the south side of Chicago. So you give them support if you can by amplifying their voices directly, or again, supporting pro-police candidates who understand that without the police, we're doomed.
Wow. This brings up another question of, if someone is curious, based on this, how do people who live in these communities continue, why do you think that they continue to lean toward the left in their political affiliations, and yet they are having these situations and seeing these things as problems, and yet their political outlook, they're not more conservative, they're still more left? How is this part of the problem?
That is a problem that has puzzled political scientists for a very long time. Also, you know, it's often noted that Blacks are socially conservative. I mean, probably the most anti-gay segment in this country besides Muslims are Blacks. The Catholic Church, you know, it's the Black African priests who are the most against gay marriage. All the white European priests are sort of, yeah, why not? And you go try having a gay pride rally in Uganda, see how far you get. But I don't know. I think part of it is just tradition. I mean, you can ask the same thing about Jews. Why do they vote Democratic when racial preferences harm them? When the Democratic Party is moving into the BDS camp, it's just bizarre. But there are these long-standing political affiliations. I would also say that there is sort of a willingness to, on some people, and I'm just going to give a very broad generalization here that is obviously not 100% coverage by any means, but there is at this point somewhat of an embrace of a victim status. And if you're handed a narrative that your problems are all due to other people, it's tempting to embrace that narrative, especially if it's enforced by every segment of society, and that there's really nothing you can do to help yourself. A lot of people are going to embrace that narrative, and that is certainly reduced to its essence of a strong part of the Democratic message.
It does seem that America has shifted from the old school value and narrative of pick yourself up by your bootstraps, if you will, make the best of what you can, you know, of your life, work hard, and you can do things. And it does seem as if there is a narrative shift, and maybe that's kind of what we're experiencing now, is we're seeing the outgrowth of this narrative shift is what we're happening. We're coming up on our time, almost toward the end, but one question that we always like to ask people who come, we thank you for speaking. What books have you been reading lately, and what books do you recommend, like, our young women to read? You have a lot of knowledge, And obviously we do recommend all of Heather's books. This is the one that would really be referencing what we spoke about today, but there's multiple other books, especially one specifically, your most recent book was dealing with university situations, which would be really helpful for the young women as well. But what other books are you reading, and what can we do to inform ourselves better?
Well, thank you for the plug, Julie. I greatly appreciate it. But my view is, if you have discretionary time, read beauty, read greatness. I reread Middlemarch by George Eliot this summer for a podcast or a video discussion I did with Michael Knowles that hasn't been posted yet, and was just stunned by George Eliot's insights into what would seem possibly the impossibility of anybody getting married, of the way that human beings misread each other, project onto the other our desires, our blindnesses, our wish for what that other person is, it's completely self-centered. But it is a very deep investigation of the variety of human experience. One of the books I read recently, not so recently, but that is eye-opening as far as the absolute value shift that you described, Julie, is H.L. Mencken's autobiography of growing up in 1880s Baltimore called Happy Days. It's part of a trilogy that's been published called the Days Trilogy, but and the second part is his newspaper, his journalism experiences. But Happy Days is just an amazing account of a very, very different world where boys were allowed to be boys, raise hell, explore things, where they were not emasculated by the safetyism culture, where there was sort of a bubbling entrepreneurship, and also a reminder of just the prosperity that we enjoy now and the comforts of life. You know, we described summers in Baltimore. Their house, the ceilings were absolutely black because they were so covered with beetles and other insects, and the strange food taboos. Children were not supposed to eat cheese or raw fruit because it would make them sick and poison them. And but it is an exuberant tale of a very different world of boyish exuberance and a American culture that was coming into its own. For another sort of culture shift, there's a book that was also an autobiography written by Richard Dana called 2 Years Before the Mast. In 1840, he was a Harvard student, came from an august Boston family, put himself on a ship, a commerce ship, because his eyesight was failing, went around the tip of South America to the California coast, tacked up and down, trading cowhides. It is the most amazing description of hard physical labor and the clash of cultures on the California coast. This was when it was still under Mexico. It is, again, an astounding portrait of a very different world.
Sound like excellent reads. I'm going to add them to my list. I never fear there's always another book to read. It's probably a little bit of the problem.
Right.
But we thank you so much for coming and virtually coming and speaking with us. And we appreciate your work. We value the truth, and if the truth is difficult, we still would like to value it and give it the place it deserves in society and speak about it. So thank you for talking to our young women, and we hope you have a lovely afternoon.
Thank you so much, Julie, and thank you for the excellent questions. I greatly appreciate it.
Thank you everyone for joining us.